The Avar Khaganate was a major early medieval state that emerged as a result of the migration of Eastern peoples. To Europeans, their past was shrouded in mystery. Having surfaced from the depths of the Asian continent, the Avars redrew the political map of Europe and compelled the leading European monarchies of the time to reckon with them. Alongside Byzantium, the Franks, and later the Bulgars, they would shape the political agenda of Eastern Europe for 250 years. Today, we will explore the origins of the Avar Khaganate and the key milestones in its history. The origin of the Avars remains a subject of debate. One of the earliest theories was proposed as far back as the 18th century. According to it, the Avars were part of the population of the Ruran Khaganate, who fled westward to escape the military threat posed by the Turks. Today, the identification of the Avars either with the Ruran or with one of the tribes that inhabited the Ruran state can be considered the prevailing theory. However, another complication lies in the fact that the origins of the Ruran themselves are highly contested, which has given rise over time to alternative hypotheses about who the Avars might have originally been. One theory holds that they, like the Mongols, belonged to the Shanbei tribal confederation. Another suggests they were of Tungusic Manchu origin. There is also a theory that the tribes which appeared in Europe under the name of the Avars were in fact not Avars at all, but Varhanites, a confederation of the Var and Kyanite tribes. The Kyanites themselves were an Iranian-speaking people. Driven westward by the expansion of the Turkic Khaganate, the Varhanites emerged between the Black and Caspian Seas, where they were mistakenly identified as Avars. Since the Avars had a reputation as formidable warriors, the Varhanites, finding themselves in a precarious situation, chose to exploit this misunderstanding to their advantage, and eventually began calling themselves Avars. In any case, even before acquiring new lands between the Alps and the Carpathians, the Avars absorbed members of many other peoples on their journey into Europe, including Slavic and Germanic groups. The very name Avars was most likely used from the early 7th century to refer to the ruling elite, and by then spoke more to a person's status than to their origin. In the 8th century, the Gepids, Bulgars, and Slavs of the Avar state also called themselves Avars if they managed to rise to the ruling class. So the only indisputable fact is that the Avars abandoned their customary lands and moved westward under pressure from the Turks, whose sweeping expansion reached as far as the Black Sea. By no later than the year 557, they had arrived in the steppe region between the Volga and the Don. There they came into contact with the Alans, allies of Byzantium, and through them established communication with Emperor Justinian I. The Avars concluded a treaty with him under which, in exchange for monetary payments, they undertook to subdue certain peoples hostile to the Byzantines, most notably the Kutrigurs, who had been plaguing the empire with their raids. Thus, they became Byzantine federates, though they acted with considerable independence. Instead of waging war against the Kutrigurs, the Avars, pursuing their own interests, formed an alliance with them. Fleeing from the pursuing Turks, the Avars abandoned the steppes between the Volga and the Don, and around the year 560, crossed the Dnieper River. Around this time, the leader of the tribal confederation, Bayan, proclaimed himself Khagan. Fighting their way forward, the Avars reached the lower Danube Basin, but they did not stop there. Instead, they pushed further west and attacked the Franks. It is possible they were acting in alliance with Byzantium, which at the time was waging war against the Franks in northern Italy. The Avar campaign against the Franks in 566 proved highly successful. The Franks were defeated when their king, Sigebert I, was captured and later released for ransom. The Avars concluded a peace treaty with them and turned their attention to the kingdom of the Gepids in the northern Danube region. That state had acquired a powerful enemy in the Lombards, who had migrated from the north. In 567, the Avars formed an alliance with the Lombards against the Gepids, and together they destroyed the Gepid kingdom. Afterward, the Lombards moved on into northern Italy, where they established their own state, marking the final stage of the Great Migration. The Lombard kingdom remained an ally of the Avars until its fall in the 8th century. The Avars themselves gained new territory for permanent settlement and established themselves in Pannonia. By around the year 580, Khagan Bayan I had consolidated his authority over most of the Slavic, Bulgar, and Germanic tribes inhabiting Pannonia and the Carpathian Basin. Under a treaty with Byzantium, the Avars continued to receive tribute from the empire in exchange for protecting its northern borders from Slavic incursions. However, whenever the empire was unable to pay or hire Avar mercenaries, the Avars would raid its Balkan territories. In 568, they plundered Dalmatia, and in 582, they captured the key city of Sirmium. By the year 600, the Avar state, which encompassed a multitude of peoples, stretched from what is now Austria in the west to the Pontic-Caspian steppe in the east. Byzantium tried to resist the invasions of its northern neighbors and occasionally managed to defeat them. But a new war with Sasanian Iran, which broke out in 602, drew Byzantine forces eastward, giving the Avars free rein in the unprotected Balkans. Moreover, when the Persians marched on Constantinople, the Khagan joined their side. With his army, he laid siege to the Byzantine capital, hoping to unite forces with the Sasanians, who had approached the city from the Asian side of the Bosporus. However, the effective operations of the Byzantine fleet prevented the Persians from crossing, prompting the Avars to attempt to storm Constantinople on their own. Byzantine sources estimated their strength at 80,000 men, likely an exaggeration, yet indicative of how grave the threat appeared from within the capital. The assault lasted several days, involving siege engines and attacks from the sea, but the legendary fortifications of the Byzantine capital proved too formidable for the Avars. They were forced to retreat, and the day of their withdrawal was celebrated in Constantinople for centuries to come. After this defeat, the political and military influence of the Avars in the Balkans diminished. Over the following decades, more and more Slavic rulers slipped out from under the direct control of the Khaganate. A major uprising broke out in Moravia under the leadership of Samo, the first Slavic prince known by name, though he himself was of Frankish origin. The independent state he founded lasted for 35 years. After Samo's death, the Avars reclaimed these lands. At the same time, the Khaganate suffered further losses in the Balkans, where Slavic princes also threw off its rule. For a time, Byzantium and the Avar state effectively ceased to share a common border. This worsened the economic situation in the Khaganate, as the flow of goods and money from Byzantium dried up. On the other hand, it also reduced the potential for conflict between the two powers. In the second half of the 7th century, diplomatic relations between the two states began to improve again, due in no small part to the emergence of the Bulgarian kingdom in the lower Danube region. For Byzantium, already entangled in tense relations with the Bulgarians, it was not advantageous to remain at odds with yet another northern neighbor. It is known that around the year 678, an Avar delegation arrived in Constantinople to congratulate the emperor on his victory over the Arabs. And yet the peak of the Avar state's power had passed. This is evident from the fact that in the 8th century, references to the Khaganate in the chronicles of its European neighbors declined significantly. Its sphere of influence shrank. The vast majority of the population settled down, and the settlements grew larger and more populous. On the weapons, pottery, and jewelry of the time, found in what is now Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia, motifs typical of nomadic culture can still be seen, yet there is also a discernible influence of Byzantine art. Clearly, a cultural symbiosis was underway, as the distinctions between the peoples who inhabited the Avar Khaganate gradually began to fade. Tensions persisted in the West. In the first half of the 8th century, the Avars attempted to subjugate the Slavic state of Carantania in the Eastern Alps. Its ruler was forced to seek aid from the Duke of Bavaria and acknowledge himself as his vassal. In the second half of the 8th century, the Bavarian ruler Tassilo III, himself a vassal of the Frankish king, sought an alliance with the Avars in hopes of freeing himself from that dependency. Charlemagne immediately put a stop to these efforts, annexed Bavaria into his kingdom, and exiled Tassilo to a monastery. By then, he had already defeated the Lombards and seized northern Italy, depriving the Avars of their strongest ally. On the western frontier, they now found themselves alone against a powerful enemy. Perhaps long-standing animosity played a role. The Avars had no intention of reaching a compromise with the Franks, and so the clash was not long in coming. In 788, a protracted war began with the Frankish kingdom, ultimately leading to the collapse of the Khaganate. The Avars first attempted to invade the Lombard Duchy of Friuli, but suffered defeat. A retaliatory invasion of Bavaria also ended in failure. In 790, Avar envoys arrived in Worms for border negotiations, but to no avail. They sought to preserve the status quo, while the Franks demanded territorial concessions. War broke out anew with even greater intensity. Under this pressure, a civil war erupted in the Khaganate in 795, resulting in the death of the Khagan. The new ruler sent envoys to Charlemagne, declaring his willingness to submit and convert to Christianity. The Franks seized upon the Avars' weakened state to launch another attack. The offensive, led by Duke Eric of Friuli and King Pepin of Italy, was highly successful. The Franks captured the Avars' treasures, accumulated over the entire existence of the Khaganate. The booty was transported to Aachen and partially distributed among the king's inner circle, but the greater portion Charlemagne presented to Pope Leo III. All of these treasures were melted down and have not survived to the present day. In the year 796, the ruler of the Avars came to the king of the Franks to pledge his loyalty and be baptized along with his retinue. But the truce was short-lived. Battles with the Franks marked the further decline of the Khaganate. Uprisings in the subjugated territories continued until 803, after which the Avars, at the request of their ruler, were granted a vassal principality within the recently established Avar March. Officially, it was abolished in 828, marking the end of the Avar state. The remaining Avar population was eventually converted to Christianity by force. The Avars in the eastern part of the state, having avoided Frankish influence, came under attack in the early 9th century by the Bulgarian Khan Krum, who sought to exploit the Khaganate's weakness. By 805, the last of the Avar lands had been conquered by the Bulgarian Empire. According to the Byzantine encyclopedia Suda from the 10th to 11th centuries, when Krum asked the Avar prisoners why their once mighty empire had fallen, they replied, "Lawsuits, bribery, deceit, and excessive drunkenness."